The etymology of the word pants may seem like a bit of a silly topic. For much of the world, they are such a mundane item, part of almost everyone's everyday life to some degree or another. They almost fade into the background. Comprehension of them as a concept is assumed. We don't really think about them, where they came from, or any possible history that they might have. But as commonplace as our word pants may be, its origins are strikingly peculiar. If we are to look at the history of the garment, we find an inflection point at which human history itself irrevocably accelerates. Civilizations are connected, conquered, and propelled into the future, but looking into the etymology of the word, influenced by politics, satire, and even martyrdom, proves to be just as fascinating. Though first associated with trousers by sketch comics in Renaissance Italy, the actual story behind pants' etymology is ancient and tragic, dating back to the time of the earliest saints, but even that is dwarfed by our oldest extant example of the garment. Dated to circa 1000 to 1200 BCE, our oldest known example of a pant comes from a desert in western China near the city of Turfan. There, the climate oscillates between frigid temperatures in the winter and scorching in the summer, but it is almost always extremely arid, making its conditions ideal for natural mummification and preservation of many artifacts. During an excavation of a cemetery, just over 40 kilometers southeast of the city, archaeologists had uncovered the grave of a man who had been buried with the effects of a warrior, a poncho for warmth, a horse bridle, a battle axe, boots, and a pair of pants woven from a coarse but strong wool. Although we may be imagining something primitive or basic, these pants were anything but simple, and in fact the construction method was quite baffling to the modern weavers who examined them. You see, unlike the pants that we wear today, these were not cut from a piece of cloth and sewn together. Instead, the garment was woven in 3 separate pieces, 2 legs and a crotch piece connecting the two. This means that the pants were actually woven specifically to fit this individual. But that wasn't the only exceptional part of this garment. The pants featured multiple kinds of weaves, the main body of it being made using a twill weave, which is incredibly popular for pants, among other things, even up to this day. This weave creates both strength and stretch, making it ideal for use in pants, particularly ones that necessitate durability and comfort. Its use could suggest a link to Central Europe, where, in the Hallstatt mines of Austria, we can find our oldest known use of the twill weave dating back about 2 centuries prior, though it is quite likely that each society developed this weave independently. What researchers find more compelling are the decorative patterns woven into the waistband, crotch, knees, and calves of the pants. These areas feature the use of 2-toned colorwork, with a step pattern found near the waist being found as far west as Mesopotamia, and the geometric interlocking T pattern featured on the knees, which has been found echoed in artifacts from Eastern Asia all the way to Kazakhstan. These more strongly suggest not only awareness but connection between these civilizations, and it is likely that the advent of pants played a crucial role in creating and solidifying these connections. Because pants, particularly pants like the ones found on our mummy Turfan Man, with their durable but stretchy cloth, well-fitting legs that were reinforced at high-impact areas like the knee, and plenty of room built around the seat of the garment for maximum mobility, made these trousers ideal for long-distance horseback riding. And this is where everything changed. The ability to ride on horseback over long distances allowed connections between disparate civilizations on the Eurasian continent. Alliances could be formed, commerce could be conducted, and lands could be conquered. Pants, as silly as it may sound, were integral to the formation of the Silk Road, the early traces of which can be found in the varying influences that we see in Turfan Man's clothing. The conquering hordes of the continent gave us warlords and cavalry, territory disputes and atrocities. It forced hierarchies and progress, whether purely for bragging rights or for the power of resource acquisition. And it never really stopped. And maybe the desire to conquer is innately human, and these conflicts had already been happening on a smaller scale. But the ability to travel long distances was crucial in accelerating the societal evolutions, and the adoption of pants made that possible. Even the Roman army, whose sovereign body famously looked on trousers in contempt, viewing them as barbaric and effeminate, still wore these garments. They were known as brache, and they are a part of the same etymological family as breeches, a more antiquated form of the garment, both descended from the Latin braca, derived from the Gaulish braca. It is uncertain whether the Gauls adapted this word from the Proto-Germanic brochitz, or the other way around, though the Oxford English Dictionary suggests that the word is Teutonic in origin. In either case, as the Roman army began conquering territories in Gaul and Germania, they adopted not only the word, but the much reviled garment. The wearing of pants made it far easier for the soldiers to keep warm and move through the rain and mud of the north. However, as Roman territory expanded, their government felt the need to combat the influences of their conquered territories and keep the Roman Empire culturally Roman. They fought material threats such as the adoption of pants, but also intangible forces within the empire, such as the expanding spiritual movement of Christianity. But while the government's banning of pants promised poverty and exile, its war on Christendom was far bloodier. You see, early Christians in the Roman Empire were not looked upon favorably for a number of reasons. There was their inherent association with Judaism, another religion persecuted by the Romans. They would also refuse to pay tributes or commit sacrifices for Roman gods, which was very concerning for other members of their communities who thought the gods would not look on them favorably as a result of their association. And they were also used as scapegoats for tragedies such as the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Even worse, the new religion posed an interesting threat to the emperor, the government, and even the nobles. Despite persecutions of Christians, the faith was gaining momentum among the lower classes of society. And it wasn't specifically a rebellion against those of noble birth, but against the idea that being highborn was sacred. In Christianity, there is heaven and there is hell, and title had no bearing on either. Baptism was an equalizer to the early Christians, and there was a lot of solace in that. This alteration of the status quo also deeply concerned the government, whose views on Christians wavered from begrudging tolerance to extermination depending on the decade. The last major persecution was carried out at the turn of the 4th century. Legend has it that one of the persecution's last victims was a doctor from Commedia, a city in the Eastern Roman Empire. The physician Pantaleon had initially been raised as a Christian by his mother. However, after her death, when he was still a young boy, he began to lose touch with her faith, being brought up instead under the influence of his father, whose beliefs were more traditionally Roman. As a man, Pantaleon applied himself to the study of medicine, becoming a very highly regarded doctor. In fact, he was so well respected that he was appointed physician to one of Rome's emperors during the Tetrarchy era. But his patients weren't all high-born and powerful. He helped common people with their ailments as well, even those shunned by the empire. While tending to patients, Pantaleon came across Hermolaus, a Christian lying low during one of Rome's persecutions. The man, a priest himself, spoke to Pantaleon of his admiration of doctors and the study of medicine, of all the good work that was being done. But he also questioned the doctor. "My friend, of what use are all thy acquirements in this art, since thou art ignorant of the science of salvation?" This sparked a discourse between the two, coaxing Pantaleon to contemplate the religion of his childhood, though he was still a bit wary of it. It is said that, on a walk, Pantaleon discovered a child lying deceased by the side of the road, apparently victim of a snakebite. As a test of the Christian God's power, he commanded the child in the name of Jesus Christ to arise, and instantly he woke. The doctor, now convinced, sought out his new friend Hermolaus and requested a baptism. But the miracles didn't stop there. Pantaleon was said to have healed a blind man as well, prompting multiple people, including his own pagan father, to convert to the new religion. But these events began to draw the wrong kind of attention, and eventually the news made its way to the emperor who Pantaleon served. Though his sovereign tried to convince Pantaleon to denounce Christianity, he refused. The emperor, wanting to test Pantaleon's faith, presented a sick man for the doctor to heal as he had done with others before. After signing the cross over the patient, the man jumped up announcing that he had been cured, but instead of seeing this as a miracle, the emperor condemned it as sorcery and Pantaleon was sentenced to death. But as it turned out, our doctor had a few more tricks up his sleeve. So the story goes, executioners tried to pull him apart with iron hooks, but to no avail. Burning him didn't work either, nor submerging him in a vat of molten lead. They tried drowning him at sea with a millstone tied around his neck. When weapons collided with him, they would bend, leaving Pantaleon unscathed. He would not be executed without his consent. When he was ready, he prayed for forgiveness for his executioner and allowed himself to be beheaded. For this, a voice is said to have called down from the heavens, baptizing him under the new name of Pantaleon, Greek for the all-compassionate one. But now he is known best as Saint Pantaleon. Despite hailing from an area of modern-day Turkey, our physician saint actually came to be highly venerated by the Venetians. There is even a church dedicated to him in the city, which dates back to at least the 12th century, though this is just our first written account of it, and it is likely that the house of worship stood for centuries before that. All of this is to say, Saint Pantaleon was of some significance to Venetians, enough so that his name became popular amongst its citizens, and he would have been easily recognizable as being associated with the city. So it seems to be of little coincidence that a Venetian character from the Commedia dell'Arte, an Italian form of street theater popularized in the mid-1500s, should share this name. Pantaleone was a curious character. He was a merchant from Venice, generally considered to be incredibly wealthy, living in glorious villas, dressed in luxurious textiles with millions hoarded away. He is even known to associate with princes and doges. His portrayals tend to vary based on the show being put on. He is often depicted as being miserly, easily deceived and lusting after young women, vicious, a braggart, and debaucherous. Admittedly a far cry from the characterization of Saint Pantaleon. But our merchant is also portrayed as an honest businessman who offered good advice. He was strict and devoted to his family. His mercurial moods are due to the nature of Commedia dell'Arte productions, which were not unlike sitcoms or sketch comedies in the modern day. These productions were predominantly improvised, but they would usually consist of soliloquies and familiar scenarios which the audience could easily understand. And even if the scene was unfamiliar, viewers would have been able to follow the cast of stock characters, each playing an easily recognizable archetype, which was further emphasized by the leather masks that they wore. Pantaleone, as mentioned, generally played a miser, though his characterization could change depending on the scene being acted out, which added unexpected facets to his personality. But what made him stand out the most wasn't his characterization, but his odd clothing. He typically dressed in a long black cloak called a cassock, which would be most recognizable to modern audiences as the cloak worn by Catholic priests. This was paired with slippers and a brimless hat. Under his cloak, he donned a tight vest, usually red to match the garish hue of his signature long scarlet breeches. And it wasn't that Pantaleone was the only character wearing trousers, but it was the nature of his, knitted, not leather, and so very close-fitting, almost like a combination between breeches and stockings, that made him stand out. Different theater troupes would travel around, taking the show and Pantaleone out of Italy to entertain the masses across the continent and even into the British Isles. The improvisational nature of the sketches allowed them to be easily adaptable to audiences of different cultural backgrounds, though the shows were especially popular in France. The decline of this theater form came when the various European dialects began to evolve too rapidly, making it difficult for traveling performers to adapt. Many of the productions started to incorporate more physical humor in order to bridge the language gap between them and their audiences, but that tactic soon lost its novelty and the shows fell out of favor toward the end of the 17th century. Yet we can still see the influence of the Commedia dell'Arte in the world today if we know where to look. These productions inspired some of history's greatest writers and actors, like Shakespeare and Molière, as well as slapstick comedians like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, and presumably sitcoms and sketch comedies in general. But it also had a pivotal role in the etymology of the word pants. You see, Pantaleone's distinctive tight-knitted, curve-hugging trousers, which looked rather silly during the mid-1500s, actually caught on a few centuries later, though in more subdued colors. And we find our first mention of the word pants in an article written by an American in the 1830s, just a few decades after the style of pantaloons rose to popularity. The Southern Literary Messenger published an article by M.M. Noah, where he describes a scandalous night out at a decadent party with a friend, who picked him up to begin the night at the ungodly hour of 10 p.m., dressed up in pumps and tight pants. Throughout the article, Noah made his disapproval of the raucous fete quite clear, citing loud music, excessive food and alcohol consumption, and dancing carrying on until past even the wee hours. And his use of our word pants in the early paragraphs of this article further illustrated his perspective, because pants initially was considered to be a vulgar term, and its casual use a signifier of society's decline. It was too casual a name for too casual a garment. This specific style of pant, as well as the word pantaloon, from which pants descends, were imported to England from France. The English word pantaloon is taken from the Middle French pantalon, which is, of course, from the Old Italian Pantaleone, named for the Commedia dell'Arte character. And while there are conflicting theories about where this name ultimately comes from, some suggest it was simply due to the habit of the time of using Greek or Greek-derived names for characters, but it seems just a little too coincidental that a Venetian character should share a name with a saint so closely associated with his motherland, so to speak, and that would help the public identify his character more easily. The theory of Saint Pantaleon inspiring the name fits in a lot of ways, but there is another saint proposed to have given the Venetian merchant his name. Although Saint Pantaleon enjoyed Venice's reverence, the patron saint of the city-state was actually Saint Mark, and it is suggested that Pantaleone is in fact a play on the words Pantaleone, meaning to plant lions. This comes from the rumored habit of Venetian merchants planting a flower called Bocca di Leone wherever they traded as a way of signifying their presence. The curious name of these colorful flowers is owed to their shape, reminiscent, as the name suggests, of a lion's mouth. In English, we know these instead as snapdragons. The Bocca di Leone is significant to Saint Mark because his symbol is a winged lion, and lions are also associated with John the Baptist, who closely mentored Saint Mark in his youth. The potential etymologies are fascinating if murky, but regardless, if pantaloons does owe its etymology to a saint, then perhaps there is an underlying irreverence to cutting the word off at the hips that made it seem vulgar in previous centuries. Or perhaps that characterization is actually due to the word itself being associated with undergarments, as pantaloons had a counterpart worn by women and small children underneath their gowns. These were known as pantalettes. Pantalettes covered each leg separately, and though some featured legs which were connected to each other as modern pants are, others had two separate legs which attached to the waistband by buttons or laces. This separation is a more primitive design, harkening back to some of the earliest iterations of what would become pants. If we travel back in time a further 2 millennia before Turfan Man rode horseback through the deserts of western China, we find a garment strikingly similar to these two-piece pantalettes on our oldest specimen of a naturally mummified human, Otzi the Iceman. He was found with leather shoes lined with grass, tatters of a leather coat and loincloth, a grass cape, fur hat, and 2 separate leggings, also made of leather, which would have been attached at the waist to a garter belt to hold them up. much like the two-piece pantalettes. And these initial garments using this construction may have had an influence on the inherent plurality of the word pants, though it is possible that this pluralization is simply an example of plurale tantum, which the Oxford English Dictionary defines as a noun which is used only in plural form or which is used only in plural form in a particular sense or senses. Now, we can on occasion come across the singular form pant, though these instances are relatively rare generally speaking. Even when referring to a single article, we pluralize the word to pants. Other examples of this would be scissors, tweezers, glasses, pliers, and of course trousers, among others. And you'll notice these examples of plurale tantum all share the common trait of dual operative parts working together. There are two blades to create a single pair of scissors, two lenses to a pair of glasses. Perhaps it isn't that there are two unattached legs to create the initial plurality of pants, but simply that there are two legs at all. But much of Pants' lore comes in two saints potentially responsible for the etymology, two mummies telling the story of how the garment evolved into what it is today, and two different uses of the word, which vary by dialect. You see, in British English, the term pants commonly refers to underwear rather than trousers, which is its common usage in American English. This is likely due to the fact that in the early 19th century, the word pantaloons was used to describe garments worn by women under their dresses. It was the English equivalent for the pantalettes we mentioned earlier. From here, as in American English, the word pantaloons was shortened to pants, but this time it was connoted specifically with underpants. And in fact, this is also where we derive the word panties from. This association with unmentionables could be the reason for the presumed vulgarity of the word in the early days of its usage, which seems to have carried over into modern British slang, where pants can be used to refer to something as nonsense or ridiculous. But it's not crazy for the word to feel silly or nonsensical. It wasn't by chance that pants became so ubiquitous, but there seems to be quite an odd series of events that led to their modern name. After all, they are named for a character in a comedy, a foil for his fellow actors, likely without heed to any potential saintly beings unwittingly caught up in the narrative. Interesting as it may have been. Thank you for coming along on this deep dive of the very extraordinary history of a very ordinary word. Please leave a like if you like this episode and subscribe so you don't miss out on our upcoming content. I would also like to take a moment to thank you for supporting human-made content. Each episode on this channel is researched, written, and produced by a human being without the use of AI, which means that each of these episodes takes an incredible amount of time to produce, so your support, even just by listening in, is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. Until next time.